a.m. on Thursday, May 21st, and I'm calling to order the special meeting of the City Council. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May I get a roll call, please?
Good evening, Councilmember Carter.
Here.
Councilmember Claytree will be noticed as absent. Mayor Gottberg.
Here.
Vice Mayor No. Councilmember Yarborough.
Here.
Right, we're going to move on to item number 3, adoption of the agenda.
I'll move adoption. I'll second.
All right, I have a first and a second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? None. We're going to move on to item 4, discussion and action items. 4.1, fiscal year 2026-2027 operating budget and capital improvement program budget review and discussion.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Joe Wren, your interim city manager. To be respectful of time, I'm going to be brief in my comments. I will assure you over the last 3 weeks, this team has worked very hard to get us a budget that we feel comfortable presenting to you. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to our finance director, Ms. Lauren Casa.
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, Mayor Gottberg and City Council members and the public for attending our operating budget workshop number 2. Really appreciate you guys. So we're going to keep it to a similar format as last year. We're going to go over a very quick presentation, which is going to go, it's very high level and it's focused on the general fund. Then we're going to go over all the handouts that were presented back on April 30th. And it's going to just kind of walk you through what was built into the budget and what we just really feel like we cannot afford. If you feel differently and there's something that's been scratched out and that is truly a priority of the city, you can let us know. And then definitely, you know, where we're at with all of our operating funds, but specifically in the presentation of the general fund. But toward the end of the presentation, I'll dive into all of the operating funds at a very high level, and there's a handout that highlights that as well. So please let me know if you have any questions while we go through this, and I will just kick things off. So, as I mentioned, this presentation is primarily focused on the general fund budget, but we also have other city operating funds, so we'll touch on those as well. And then also we're looking to get approval on the capital improvement program budget from what was originally presented on April 30th and where we've landed as of May 21st today. So general fund budget, that is our true source of discretionary dollars. It pays for most major city services, including public safety, parks, and recreation. So when we began this budget season, we had a status quo budget just out the gates of $974,452 deficit to the general fund. Then what we presented on April 30th was additional requests each department head presented to you, which included like alternative service levels, computer equipment, other capital outlay, capital improvement projects, and conference training and travel. Those additional requests that were presented on April 30th was $1.19 million. So if we go with the status quo budget, plus if we went forward with all of those requests, that would put, as of April 30th, just 3 weeks ago, the city of Placerville had a total general fund deficit of $2.1 million. So as Joe mentioned, we've put a lot of work into this. And us as a budget team, which includes our city manager, as well as all the department heads, we met on May 6th and May 13th. And during those meetings, we really looked at, you know, each department head was responsible to look at their line item expenses, as well as any of the additional requests that were presented on April 30th. After we very carefully looked through all that, we were able to reduce the deficit from 2.1 million to 860,527. And so that is the budget we'll be presenting to you guys tonight. As Joe mentioned, there are some scenarios and options to lower that deficit even further, but we would like to discuss those in closed session. And we are recommending additional budget adjustments. We are looking for your guys' direction. And the city manager and I will share those options in closed session, and just want to let the public know that if, some of these adjustments are approved, that program delivery may be affected in certain areas. So something we usually do is we look over a year-over-year comparison. So when you look at the current budget for the general fund, you see revenue was 11 million, operating expenditures are 11.9 million. Then we have the net transfers in. So we had total expenditures of 12 million. So when we kind of started this process last year, we were actually at a higher deficit of 1.3 versus currently what we presented on April 30th, even though we didn't present the general fund budget, just the status quo budget had our revenue at 11 million, operating expenditures at 11.5, net transfers in. So it had a $12 million expenditure. So the status quo budget was $974,000 deficit. As I had just mentioned, we met on the 6th and the 13th, and were able to make adjustments both to the requests that we presented on April 30th, as well as our line items. So, which is a challenge because a lot of the department heads already came in with very conservative numbers. And that's why when you look at 25, 26, before we made adjustments, we had a $1.3 million deficit, whereas today, status quo, $970,000 deficit, because we knew it was going to be a tough budget year. And so everybody, we're a team, and we really looked at our expenses, and we're very reasonable. Just to remind you of last year, there were adjustments of $1 million. We totally wiped out ASLs. Computer equipment was $40,000, capital outlay $6,000, conference training travel $21,000. And I want to be very clear. Last year, we did go into a deficit. I think we presented a balanced budget, but in closed session, changes were made, certain things, and we went in with a $300,000 deficit this current fiscal year. When I presented at mid-year in March, because we have some unstaffed FTE positions, we think that we can maybe reduce that deficit to $170,000. So today, what we're looking at is the upcoming budget for 26-27. So we've made budget adjustments. That's what happened on the 6th and the 13th. And there's $236,000 of expenses. Some of that was we were able to increase revenue in engineering and other recreational services. And then we just really looked at our ASL requests, computer equipment, capital outlay, CIP and conference. So those adjustments netted $113,000, getting our deficit to $860. But you can still see that's $550,000 more than the previous year. So as Joe mentioned, we're primarily, this presentation, we will talk about the other operating funds in brief detail, and of course, if there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. But when we look at the general fund and really what revenue sources do we have for the general fund, it's primarily made up of sales tax. That's our Bradley Burns 1% sales tax. And then the next biggest one is all other taxes. What are those? That includes property tax, TOT tax, cannabis tax. Then we have our, so it's not necessarily in order of, amount of revenue, but construction permits. Then we go into intergovernmental revenue, and that's primarily vehicle license fees, charges for service, that's like planning, recreation, engineering, police services, fines and forfeitures, then use of money and property, which is primarily interest, and other financing sources, which is overhead, fines and forfeitures, or like vehicle code fines, abatement, if they're development services fines. So what you can see here, when you look at a year-over-year budget, we went from total revenue of $11 million to total revenue of $11 million. So when you can see a year-over-year increase, we are projecting a very mild increase of $86,000, which is less than 1%. So basically the story we're telling you is revenue is flat year-over-year. Yes, it helps. If I look at each line item, we work with HDL on the sales tax. They're projecting a very, very small, and we share this with you guys every quarter at City Council, but it's a minimal increase. It's relatively flat. Construction permits, just development is down. Middletown issued, I think, last year, so that really helps. So we're revising that one down. Everything else is up a little bit. Fines and forfeitures slightly down. I think it's on code fines. But overall, the story to tell is for our revenue sources, we're projecting them to be flat. It's a different story when it comes to expenditures. So let's dive into expenditures. So when you look at your total expenditures for last year, we were projecting, this now includes the net transfers out, 11.3 million. Our proposed budget that we're sharing with you tonight is 12 million. And so we're having an increase of 643,000. So you can see how revenue is flat, but we're forecasting expenditures to increase over 5%. Okay, where are those increases coming from? So police is relatively flat. You can see it's 3.8%. I do want to call out, as you guys are aware, we have an add-on sales tax called Measure J. That brings in about $1.4 million, which helps offset our police. That is not included in this number, and currently applicable Measure J expenses that can be funded through that add-on sales tax are outpacing the sales tax. So really that number is like $4.8 million. So when you look at police and how much of that is part of the general fund budget, it's over $4 million, just so you guys know. Development services, you're seeing a big increase of 20%, and that has to do with we didn't budget Camino, which is Clarity, our online building permit software that also has capabilities for planning and code and engineering. There's a $20,000 annual software cost that wasn't budgeted for last year, that is budgeted for this year. We also have a $60,000 CIP that for the 7th cycle housing element that we have to do. So if you just add 20,000 for Clarity, 60,000 for that 7th cycle housing element, as well as we had grant funding for compost. We're forecasting we don't have it this year. I actually just talked to Carol just 2 minutes before this meeting started. We might be able to get that $17,000 down to $7,000, but that's kind of where you see a big increase in development services, is because of those fees. Engineering, that increase has to do with, even though we have 2 vacant engineering positions, we build that in because they're approved positions, so they are built in at Family Medical at a step 3. We've also built in a part-time intern. They likely won't overlap, but that's just how we do our budget. So when we put in the intern, and Melissa and our team are in desperate need of a printer. So we were able to move a lot of the computer equipment to next year, but there were certain ones that were priority. Community services, relatively flat. Public Works, relatively flat. City Council, relatively flat. City administration, legal fees are coming in higher. That's driving a lot of it. Also, it's elections, which makes it a little bit higher for city administration. Finance, year over year, there's still savings, and that's really with underfilling the assistant city manager, director of finance position with a director of finance position. There's quite a bit of savings there. And then non-departmental. So I just wanted to be clear and just to simplify it, this is showing $643,000 in additional expenses year over year. And then so you might say, well, why are you at an $860,000 deficit? Because we were at a $300,000 deficit last year. So you have to add that as well. So that was what I just at a high level wanted to highlight. I want to show you how we were able to reduce that 2.1 million to the 860. So we've provided additional handouts for the public and city council. But there is some good news here. All other operating funds are balanced or actually have a slight surplus. So we did a lot of work there, and we feel good about all of our operating funds. The work that needs direction from city council is primarily with the general fund. So before I go into the handouts, I just wanted to see if there were any questions.
Are there any questions from the council? Any questions from the public? All right, looks like nobody has questions.
Okay, great. One of the first handouts I'll be reviewing is the purple bar. That is our capital improvement program budget. Sorry for the fine print, but what you can see is anything that was crossed out. So this is what was presented on April 30th. Now, anything that's been strike through means we don't have funding for it. And what you'll see that is pretty obvious is we had to strike, you know, the general fund, what was hitting the general fund. The only item we kept hitting the general fund was that 7th cycle housing element that is a requirement. Carol Kendrick, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, the 7th cycle is another unfunded mandate from the state. We did go through RFP process, and I do have that staff report coming to the city council. On Tuesday, we received 2 proposals. The one that we're recommending is, we got down, I believe, to like 216,000, but that's over 2 years. That would be over 3 fiscal cycles. So the kickoff for the 7th cycle housing element won't begin until probably early January of 2027. So we'll have, I'll use that 60,000 to kind of kick that off, and then we'll probably ask for most of what is needed in the 27, 28, and then whatever else we need to kind of finish that up. So it would be half of a fiscal year of 28, 29. But yeah, it is a requirement. I am looking at potential funding sources. So I'm closely watching AB 2002, which would restore REAP funding. It was in appropriations, and I know I think it went to hearing last week, so I need to check up on that. Also, we do have the ability to try and obtain CDBG funds. We've missed it this year, but for next year and the following year, we can apply for CDBG funds and use that towards the housing element. And then something that I'll bring to the council at a future date is trying to get a pro-housing designation, because that will open up some more funding for the housing element. So I am trying to look at creative ways to help fund this, but you know, at this point, we don't have any funding.
Thank you, Carol. The other fund on the capital improvement program budget that had to get crossed out was the gas tax fund. That's our SB1, Fund 210, and it's for our road maintenance rehabilitation, as well as our highway user tax, and that's about $600,000. And Nick Stone, our Public Works Director, had presented annual street striping and a couple other items. We had to scratch those out strategically because instead of funding these projects that aren't as critical as funding the general fund. So that is going to be a transfer in from Fund 210 to the general fund to help offset some of the public works labor that is hitting the general fund. We did that last year. We're doing that this year. And that's what's helping us reduce that $2.1 million to the 860. But I just want to be clear that we aren't funding any of those programs because we're moving that money over to the general fund. Nick, did you want to say anything about, no, because Nick and I talked and that, and includes the capital improvement program budget. Are there any questions? The next handout is the blue bar. And so we will be going over the capital outlay request summary, and the same you see here was presented on April 30th. And everything that's been scratched out is not included in our budget that we're presenting tonight. So, good news is there are going to be a couple changes. There was a meeting that was held, I think, on Tuesday, maybe Wednesday of this week. We are going to move the Cannabis Community Benefit Fund. It's going to fund 4 or 5 public water fountains instead of the bleacher replacement and the benches. So there'll be a couple changes to this. So what you can see is, again, we had to hyper-focus on the general fund and to reduce that deficit. So every department head looked at their requests. They said this is a 1, 2, or 3, a 1 being like really critical, 2 and 3 not being as critical. I can tell you the Mission Darkness blocker locker, that is grant funded, so that moved from the general fund, so there won't be a cost there, so that will take place. We decided to keep the truck for investigations because the cannabis is going to take 2/3 of that. So lowering that general fund cost. Everything else, that's the only thing we're recommending for the general fund is the truck replacement for investigations. And again, 2/3 of that cost will be covered with the Cannabis Community Benefit Fund. Yeah, so, and like I said, for the parks, which also hits, so you'll see is kind of a reoccurring thing, primarily police and Parks and Rec hit the general fund. And so generally when we do these budget workshops and revenue is flat, they're going to get hit the hardest on the new requests. So working with Dennis, our Director of Community Services, we do believe that there's an opportunity for some donations, whether it's for the industrial outdoor sound system or, the portable swamp cooler. If we can get the donations, we move forward with them. If we can't secure the donations, we don't. But right now, the only thing that we're recommending as a capital outlay for the general fund for budget 26-27 is for support in the truck replacement. And that's really the only thing that we had to scratch out was general fund line items for capital outlay. Are there any questions?
I have none. Any question from the public?
Check.
Mike Potter. Got a couple questions. On the police investigation truck, you think that is new or can you use that as, can you buy differently rather than buy used? The plan is to purchase.
So those have been crossed out. There was a meeting and they didn't make this. We're going to not fund the park benches or the bleachers, and instead cannabis is going to fund the water fountains. So that will be updated in the budget.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your question. The next handout is the yellow bars, which is our alternative service level request. Again, this was presented on April 30th. We're presenting it again tonight, May 21st. Everything that was crossed out is we're not recommending funding and is currently not built into the budget. And if we're looking at, it's primarily looking at the general fund, we are recommending for ASLs this fiscal year, $30,000, 538. And that just has to do with most of it is being funded through water and sewer and was part of the rate study, but that is abolishing the current public works superintendent position and promoting that position to a new deputy public works director position. That has about a net cost of that $30,000, and that would hit the general fund, but it would also hit water and sewer. But that's where that $30,538. All the other requests that were hitting the general fund, like an additional police officer or a new maintenance worker, those have been scratched out. And Nick, did you want to speak to the new Deputy Public Works Director position?
Thanks,
Natalie. All I'd add to that is that that was one of the positions that was included in the rate study, and that the majority of that's from the water and sewer. Any questions on it?
Okay, okay, no questions? So let me just, give me 1 second to pull up conference training and travel. So what I have up on the screen, it's the green bars. I know it's very difficult to read. I'm sorry for that. This is handled a little differently. Instead of crossing them out on the summary, we cross them out on the white handout that has 15 pages. So you can see, but what I want to just kind of explain here is we are recommending net cost for conference training and travel, $44,638. Of that, $17,038 hits the general fund, but we do have $10,000 in grant funding, $5,000 for grants, that's our safety grant with NCCSIF, and then post reimbursement. So what you'll see in the operating budget is we are only recommending $7,038 hit the general fund because it is and that's primarily for police. So if you look at those first couple line items, you'll see police patrol, $10,405, police investigations, $2,350, records and dispatch, $4,000. So a total $16,813. But like I said, we have costs. The net cost will be only $6,000 because we can get grant funding for 10 of it. And then community services for $225. So you can take a look at these, see what was crossed out. We, again, met with, this was the part of the May 6th and May 13th meeting. We met with each department head. We said, you know, we're already going in with a deficit at status quo. What additional requests are going to be mandated or required? If there's anything that we can hold off on, let's hold off on it. If we don't have funding for it. Dennis, do you want to just speak to that $225? And it's page 10. CPR. It's just CPR and first aid, five.
Yeah, and for personnel, I mean, our park staff need to be certified. Those are some of the initiatives we should have started, but are now getting started on.
Okay, do you guys have any questions regarding conference training and travel? Okay, let me just. Okay, great. So the next up will be the equipment, the computer equipment, and I'm just going to be extremely transparent. This is kind of hard to read. We are going to relook at this as a citywide. We are going to have our interim director of IT meet with each department head and really take inventory of our equipment. And one of the things we did was we met with each department head and said what immediately needs to be replaced and what could be, you know, postponed. And so we were able to significantly, what you'll see on the last page of the equipment workbook is that we're down to this year, this upcoming year, requesting $32,566. Of that, $16,557. So $16,000 is general fund. But next year, we have a forecasted need of $189,000 in equipment. So we are really passing the buck and moving a lot of our purchases till next year. It's going to give us a little bit of time to really analyze what we have. And what I will say that a lot of the things we have are close to end of life, if not end of life. But again, as great department heads, we all worked to, you know, reviewed it and said what can't wait and what can. And that's, but this is a larger item that we're going to need to solve for and really see what needs to be replaced. And I think Joe has some ideas too about financing some of those items too. So, but we're just going to do a deeper dive. But right now we were able to significantly move everything to next year. That isn't critical. That needs to be replaced. Are there any questions? Okay, before I go into the draft operating budget summary that goes over all of the operating funds at a very high level, I just wanted to kind of show you guys all the work that we have done in the last 2.5 weeks to get to a $2.2 million deficit to an $860K deficit. What did that look like? What departments and divisions were hit the hardest? And what changes were made. So we went over what changes were made on those additional requests that were presented, but we haven't gone over what changes were made to our line item expenditures that, you know, we deal with every day. So the handout that I'm going over is front and back, 8 pages, and we start with the general fund. It's our draft budget adjustments for this upcoming fiscal year. At the very top, it goes over our revenue adjustments. So you can see that construction permits were revising down. Plan check fees were revising down. Construction permits, 20,000, plan check fees, 3,000, notice of noncompliance, slightly increase, and CDD record duplication revising it down by $2,000. So Carol Kendrick, Development Services, she really took a look at our line items. Of course, we were here to do adjustments to increase revenue, but we also want to present a realistic of our budget. So we got these numbers have to be, you know, realistic. But I just wanted to hand it off to Carol to kind of explain why she was revising down some of these line item revenues.
The revisions are based on we had the Mallard apartments issued in this fiscal year, and then working on actually we had Middletown and Mallard the previous year. So we had higher than normal inspection fees and plan check fees. And we had some subdivision housing that was going forward. So that is all complete. We don't really have anything else on the books, so I don't anticipate any big projects coming forward unless we can get the hotels coming forward. But I just wanted to be realistic, and we are starting to see things kind of slowing down. So that was the reason for the reductions.
Thank you, Carol. So Melissa went back to her revenue and expenditure list and was able, she took a, you know, well, I'll hand it over to Melissa, but the good news here is she thinks she revised up her revenue for other engineering services by $40,000. Thank you, Melissa. Now I'd like to hand it off to Dennis, our Director of Community Services. He was able to revise up his other recreation fees by $37,682.
Shot. Check. Nope. At this point, a couple of the programs that we ended up adding back were adult softball tournaments. I think everybody kind of understands that we adjusted and modified the league schedule, which allows us a little bit of a gap in between to host our own adult softball tournament, which has a little bit of a higher price point and a greater percentage in regards to revenue. The second piece is to focus on pickleball, which is a very popular sport. And so ideally, we want to capitalize on the $500,000 pickleball court that we have at Lions Park to be able to bring in some of those revenues. And then another piece that we want to be able to take a little bit of a deeper dive into, pun intended, most likely aquatics in regards to some of the things that we've been treading water on. And other things that we really want to look at is our fee schedule for all of our programs in regards to direct costs and indirect costs, whether or not that would be an administrative component to it, and looking at where the market is and finding that equilibrium between what are people willing to pay and where are other programs in regards to that. I think we've done a very good job, and I applaud City Council to be able to understand we're willing to subsidize certain programs, but I think we're at the point right now to be like, okay, well, if it's intentional and it's specific and it's a specialty program, then we almost need to basically charge what the cost is, right? It's that value versus worth component. I think there are some policies that we kind of need to take a look at, and really instead of bringing council a program every other month, really systematically looking at what does a master fee schedule look like, what are those billable rates, and where are the policies and parameters, so then staff can be a little creative around where is the niche and where will we get the greatest return on our investment. I know that was a really big speech, but we really need to focus on a lot of those things. Where's our revenue at? Where are our expenditures? And what are the things that we're willing to subsidize, whether it's essential, and if it's not, then we need to charge the right price.
Thank you, Dennis. So budget adjustments for revenue ended up, we're bringing in, once we met as a group and really looked at our revenue projections and forecasts, we were able to increase our revenue projection for 26-27 by $57,982. Now, we also took a hard look at our line item expenditures. Each department was tasked to look at those. So for the police department and patrol, they were able to reduce it by $13,850. Investigations reduced their line items by $6,500. Records management, $3,500. Dispatch, $6,750. And then the administration, $15,200. So for the police department, they were able to lower their expenditures by $45,800. Joe, would you like to speak to that at all, or just how we came to those adjustments?
Well, I know it's not lost on anybody. When we make these reductions, we also have to take a look at our ability to provide the service to the community. And so that really was our base. We knew that we can land on that line, but we can't go below it, or our providing that service would suffer. So we really took a look at what we had specifically as far as equipment, and can we stretch it a couple more years. Some of the things that we are going to have to monitor more closely are the overtime expenditures, the stuff that continues to go up when we don't have enough coming in. So the team at the police department is acutely aware of this, the scenario we're in, and I'm confident that given this reduction, that they're going to be able to meet those expectations the community has as far as our police department. So we took a really hard look at it, and we're going to make that dollar go a little bit farther than it has before.
Thank you. And then, so yeah, if you guys are following along, we're on page 2. It's that was highlighted in red, and we were just kind of going over how we got there. So now I'd like to hand it off to Melissa Savage, our city engineer. She was able to reduce her engineering service fees expenditure by $10,000.
This one's pretty simple. This is the budget that we use for unforeseen external contract services that we need to use. For the most part, that is all reimbursed by developers on development projects. So this is just kind of budget available in case we
Thank you, Melissa. Next up is Development Services Department, which includes building, planning, and administration. Carol Kendrick and her team looked at their line items. When you see something in parentheses, it actually means the expenditure increased. We are forecasting an increase in personnel services that has to do with a part-time planner, because the ASL for the planner isn't going to be recommended to be funded this year. So you see an increase there, but she really scrubbed her line items. So there is an increase for planning, but there's a decrease in building. There could be even an additional decrease. She's still working on her budget, which is incredible. But then where you'll see overall development services has actually an increase in expenditures, and that has a lot to do with just increasing the part-time hours for a planner, because we don't have budget for a full-time planner, and then the increase unforeseen expenditures for the compost, but we're projecting it might be less than $17,000. So whereas Joe was able to reduce his expenditures by $45K, Melissa was able to reduce her expenditures by $10K, Development Services actually increased their expenditures by $26K. Carol, do you want to just highlight those items?
The majority of that is the Clarity software. So we're in the third year, but it has never been included in the previous budgets. So that is one of the big expenses, $19,500. And again, for the composting, that was paid for out of a grant that is no longer available. So Dina, our development technician, was on the phone today and has secured a $7,000 option for us on the composting. So she's getting all the information, and we actually have first dibs on it. So my staff is working hard to try and reduce our cost. But yeah, the increases are because of, no more funding and then including our software.
Thank you, Carol. Next up is the Public Works Department, which is made up of general street maintenance. That was able to be reduced by $7,535, street sweeping by $300, storm drains $2,500, and signs and markings $3,200, for a total decrease in expenses of $13,535. I'd like to hand it over to Nick Stone, our Director of Public Works, to talk about how he got to lowering those expenditures.
We went back to the budget numbers that were approved from last year. That's basically all I did. So some of that, the original draft budget was in anticipation of cost of goods and services going up for just everything that takes for us to do our day-to-day activities. And we're just going to structure it for you.
Thank you, Nick. So next we're on, if you're following along, page 3, Administration Department, which is made up of City Council, City Attorney, IT, Human Resources, and City Clerk. We are recommending reducing City Council by $2,000, City Attorney $23,000, IT $3,600, Human Resources $5,000. You will see that elections wasn't budgeted for when we did our initial budget in April, so we had to account for that as an adjustment. So there's the $7,000 there, but at the end of the day, for Administration Department, we are lowering our expenditures, projecting to be able to lower those line item expenditures by $28,000. I'll hand it over to Joe.
I just want to make one brief comment about specifically the city attorney. We were pretty aggressive. The prior person that sat in the chair I'm sitting in now cut it pretty significantly. I've talked to Mona over the last couple days regarding the services that are provided, and I think some of the challenges the city has faced over the recent past have occurred because people who were not attorneys tried to offer legal opinions or tried to do contracts themselves, and it kind of created an issue for us. So as we'll keep it at the 72.5, but I have some concerns going forward. So just out of transparency.
Appreciate that, Joe. So then finance, we actually had the status quo budget from last year, so I could not make any more adjustments. So there's nothing there. For Community Services Department, which is made up of parks, recreation and facilities. For parks, Dennis and his team looked at their line item expenditures, and they were able to reduce parks by $83,929. A lot of this has to do with overtime. It's basically just wiping out the overtime. So when you look at the account description and you see Rotary Park overtime, City Park overtime, that is a big focus, is that we are trying to reduce our overtime across the board. So that is something that was cut this year that we're proposing. For Recreation Division, that was $19,577 in cuts. Again, a lot of that is overtime. And then facilities, a lot of it's overtime. That's $3,850. So for Community Services Department, they were able to reduce their line item expenditures by $107,356. I'd like to hand it off to Dennis to kind of just highlight those reductions.
I know it sounds funny, but overtime's cheaper than a body. And the reality is, I think the interim city manager spoke best around the level of service and understanding that, unfortunately, based on the 48 areas of responsibility that we have, including parking lots, 3.5 miles of trail, 62-acre park at Goldbug, there are most likely some things that are going to get missed. And I genuinely believe our community is amazing at volunteering and helping out, and volunteers are awesome. But without the personnel and the staffing bandwidth to herd all these passionate people out there to pick up garbage, there are some things, unfortunately, that we just need to make some decisions on that may or may not get done. And in some cases, look at some fees so that we can recover some of those costs.
Thank you, Dennis. So to wrap up the general fund, so all the department heads worked really hard. They looked at their line item budgets. This was part of the status quo budget, and we were able to reduce it, the general fund by $178,920. We actually have additional savings because we're recommending $57,982 of revenue. So we're adding $57,000 of revenue. We're reducing our expenditures by $178,000, which is netting $236,000. So that is one of the ways we were able to get from 2.1 to $860,000. So when I go over the other, I just really quickly, I know we're focusing on the general fund, but there was also some additional work with line item expenditures to get all the other funds to balance, our operating funds. So the next page is 5. It's our downtown parking fund. It's Fund 230. We are slightly revising down contract services for the city manager department, IT, but where the biggest hit was last year, as well as this year, we went in a status quo of a $20,000 unforeseen operating expenditure line item, and we are reducing that so to $6,000. And really, if you look at year to date in the current fiscal year, we've only spent $5,000. So to forecast and budget $6,000 is reasonable. But of course, we don't want to be in a place where we're not building up reserves or contingency, and unfortunately, that's the place we're in. So that would be the first line item to go, is anything that's like unforeseen, we close that out. So we are balanced for the downtown parking fund, but those were the adjustments we had to make to get to that balance. Orchard Hill LMD, that's our lighting and landscaping fund. In order to balance, this doesn't have an inflator, so the revenue we bring in is consistent, similar to sales tax, to be honest, but it's flat, whereas expenditures, as we all know, keep going up. So we, this year, had to cut contract services. I worked with Dennis on that, and to reduce that by $2,600 gets us to a balanced budget. The next one is Orchard Hill BAD, Zone 1 and 1A. Again, doesn't have an inflator, so the revenue we're bringing in is going to be flat. And so I worked with Nick, and we were able to get that balanced by reducing other contract services for storm drains, and we reduced that by $2,675 to get to a balanced budget. Okay, the big one, one of the big ones, Sewer Enterprise Fund. You won't see the Water Enterprise Fund because we have a slight surplus thanks to the rate study and increasing the rates. However, for sewer, we were going in, even with the rates, at a slight deficit of $40,000. So I worked with Melissa and Mike, our chief plant operator, and we were able to reduce sludge hauling, polymer, and aluminum sulfate to get to a balanced sewer budget. So those were the adjustments that were made to our status quo budget. And I just want to see if there's any questions before I go into the overall operating budget and all of the funds. Primarily, and all funds don't have a budgeted contingency. Oh. Well, we'll definitely go $300,000 over if we do nothing, because we're already going in with revenue flat in that $300,000 plus another 5% increase in expenditures, even with scrubbing these line items. So that got us to the 800. But yes, we don't have contingency or reserve, and there will likely be unforeseen expenditures. Great question. Are there any other questions before I dive into the last handout?
A lot of that infrastructural components, especially as it has to do with Orchard Hill, I want to be very, very clear that yes, that district does not have an inflator. It also hasn't been adjusted since 1996. It's 2026. So those are some of the structural things that we definitely need to address. And it is a very hard conversation to have, but I want to be clear. $1996 will not pay for 2026 services.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so last but not least is our draft operating budget summary. So these go over all of our operating funds. The first fund, I know it's very hard to read, but it's our general fund. Again, just to recap, revenues before these adjustments that we just reviewed, so bringing in that extra 57,000, adding that, reducing the line item expenditures by 178,000, we were at revenue of 11 million, expenditures of 11.5, which had revenues over expenditures 474. But when you do the transfers in and transfers out, like the transfer out, 900 of that, actually 976,000 of that is Measure J, is Police Department. So you have to add that back in, even though it's an approved expense of that sales tax add-on dollar, the sales tax isn't keeping up with that expenditure. So we have to transfer it back in and then general fund pays for it. So that's why, even though when you see revenues over expenditure, it's only $474,000 deficit, but when you take in the transfers in and out, then you're actually at a $974,000 deficit. So that is our status quo deficit. Then we just went over the $236,000 in adjustments that were made. And again, that was bringing, reducing our line item expenditures by the 178, bringing in that 57,000 additional revenue. And then it shows all our add-on expenditures. As we had mentioned, ASL request 30,000. That's for the Deputy Public Works Director. Computer equipment of the 16,000. The other capital outlay request of the 8,000, which was helping pay for the replacement vehicle truck for the investigations. The 60,000 for the 7th cycle, and the 7,000 for the conference training and travel. Again, really good cost. That reduced it from 17 because we can get $10,000 for grants, and really whittled it down because this is just primarily like required police training. So those adjustments, when you look at 974,000 status quo, able to say, reduce that by 113,000 gets us to where we are today at a $860,527 deficit. And then I just also want to point out that when we look at gas tax, we couldn't fund any of those CIPs. We moved over $651,000 into the general fund to lower that $2.1 million. So all that money, you won't see any, it's being put to use, and it's transferring in to the general fund. Measure L is going to support CIP projects as well as a public works project was that crack sealer. So that's good news. Any balance with Measure L just goes into operating reserve or construction reserve. And it's important that we do build a construction reserve. We'd like to build the reserve for all of our funds. So that's what's showing there. As I had mentioned, downtown parking, we were able to balance it with those adjustments, SRO and the COPS fund. Those are just like pass through, whatever revenue we bring in, it gets, whatever the expenditure is, we get the revenue for. Measure J, again, it's a quarter add-on sales tax. We're projecting $1.4 million. However, that program costs the city about $2.4 million. So that's $976,000 that gets hit to the general fund. Community benefits, a great thing. We went over our recommendations for funding for that. That last $5,000 balance is for the Fire Safe Council donation. General CIP fund, that is actually like part of the broadband. It covers 50% of our interim IT director, which is great. So that actually gets transferred into the general fund, reducing that. We talked about how we were able to lower Orchard Hill LMD fund by $2,600 to balance. How we were able to lower Orchard Hill Zone 1 and 1A by $2,600 to balance. Cottonwood, that has an inflator, and so and it's a new CFD, So revenue is outpacing expenditures, but that revenue just builds up a reserve. So it stays within the fund. So that actually has a surplus. However, that's a new development, storm drains and other things will come up, costs will increase, and that's why it's important to build up that reserve. The second page goes over our water enterprise fund. We didn't have to make any adjustments, we balance. Sewer enterprise, we were able to reduce line item expenditures by 40,000. I went over those, so right now we have just a small surplus of 15,000. Measure H, you're just seeing a small surplus because that's interest, the general liability, and the reserve for economic certainty. So again, all but our general fund is balanced or has a surplus for reserves. And that really concludes our open session presentation, but we would be happy to answer any additional questions you have.
What's the status of our overall reserve balance for the city right now?
I'm going to be completely transparent, and we are behind on our financial statements and closing our books.
Okay.
But generally, GASB is that you have like a 20% reserve of your general fund, and I would say it's around $2 to $4 million.
Okay.
Would any member of the public like to comment on 4.1? All right, we're going to move on to item 5, closed session, 5.1. Labor negotiations meeting with Patrick Clark, Joe Wren, and Natalie Tornakostka pursuant to Government Code 54957.6. Would any member of the public like to comment on our closed session before we adjourn into closed session? Nope. Okay, we're going to move into closed session. He's like pointing at